Hello, my friends. I'm Flora speaking out, and thank you so much for joining me today. You know, after I finished my sharing with you last week, I suddenly remembered something to the point where I almost shouted out to all of you, hey, come back, please. I just remembered something very important. Yes, you may recall I was talking about science fiction movies which seem to reflect the anxieties and fears of communities. And I suddenly remembered seeing as a child in the newsreels of the movie theaters back in the 1930s something that scared me much more than any giant apes or later on radioactive dinosaurs and rats and the rest. This was not science fiction. What I was seeing in that newsreel was actually happening. It was, as I said, in the 1930s during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl in the Midwest states. And to add to the general horror of the times, there came, as has happened, I'm afraid, right through history in many countries, the great locust swarms, the grasshoppers, millions of them. It almost seemed like one monster, a natural monster, with a million bodies. These great swarms of the locusts descending on the wheat fields, the corn fields, the orchards, and literally devouring every organic thing in sight. Everything, all were, every last one, leaves, stalks, corn ears, wheat, the rest of it, gone. They could stay there for days until everything was eaten. And then, when everything was stripped bare, the wind would lift them and they would blow to another field, maybe hundreds of miles away. And as I was remembering that awful memory, I must have been about 8 years old, 7 maybe, when I saw this, I was thinking of the similar holocausts of history. I don't for a minute mean to say that nature was imitating history. Though what's interesting, there in the 30s, that was the time of the great rise of despots, dictators all over the world, just like King Kong was filmed just at that time. No, I don't mean to say nature's imitating history, but I do think that history often seems to imitate the devastations and holocausts of nature. Way back, ancient documents talk about this. The purges, the clean sweeps that governments often inflict on their own people. Back to the Roman Empire, the Christians, for 300 years persecuted. And it came to its height, the worst of it, in the 200s AD, or Common Era, under the Emperor Decius. Before that time, the persecution of Christians was pretty sporadic. It all depended on the mood of the emperor at that time. But under Decius, it became systematic. He sent out teams of terror to wayside people, draw them in. At every corner of every street was a statue of the bust of the emperor and a little fire and incense. And if passers-by, minding their own business, were hauled in by these teams, either you drop incense into the fire as a sign of worship of your emperor, or you go to prison. He almost wiped out the Christian church at that time. All right, let's move on. The Jewish pogroms, right through the centuries. The government sponsored teams of terror to watch which chimneys didn't have smoke on the Jewish Sabbath, for they knew they wouldn't be cooking. Teams of terror standing by the marketplaces to notice the housewives who were not buying pork, then reported to the authorities, jailed, executed. Let's move on several hundred years. The witch persecutions sweeping over Europe and even affecting America. 300 years of witch persecutions. Not during the Dark Ages or medieval times, but at the height of the Renaissance, the beginning of the Baroque era, times of great art, literature, science, and the height of the witch persecutions were the years 1560 to 1630, which was called the Great Hunt. And the government paid teams of terror, literally, to go from town to town, forcing the authorities in each of these towns to cooperate with their terror tactics. Sometimes a town would be decimated. So-called witches hung, burned, drowned, imprisoned. And I'm not exaggerating. If it was a small town, sometimes everyone in that town would be condemned as witches. And then the teams of terror would move on like the great locust swarms into the next town to catch vulnerable people. 100,000 people during those years were persecuted, 80% of them women. Every last one. There was the motto of these teams. Well, let's move on to the great French and Russian revolutions. Every aristocrat or associated with an aristocrat or somebody who might speak in mercy for the ones being slaughtered, they were to be wiped out, whether men, women, or children. Every last one, like the great locust swarms. Let's move to our own country. A few years before the Civil War, and I've talked about this before, of course, the Supreme Court passed the Dred Scott decision that slave owners could claim escaped slaves, for essentially they were the property of the slave owners. And teams of slave hunters would go up into the free states and to the free territories and break into houses, break into churches, hauling back slaves into the slave states. Teams of terror paid by the government to do this. Let's look at my own lifetime. I've seen 3 examples of the teams of terror and the purges and the clean sweeps. I have seen them and remember them. 1941, the West Coast Japanese American citizens swept up, no matter if they were citizens, no matter if they lived in this nation for several generations, no matter if their sons were in the armed forces, it made no difference. Every single one swept up, put in detention, not slaughtered, but some died under the hardships, and they lost their fortunes, being given sometimes only 3 days to sell their property, and kept in detention in cold, windy, desolate places for the whole period of the war. I remember that. Another purge, clean sweep, reign of terror, from 1947 to 1957. The Senator Joseph McCarthy, and I've of course mentioned him before, who rose up and somehow obtained an iron grip on the American government, a true reign of terror, accusations of treason with little or no evidence, arrests, imprisonment, deporting, civil liberties violated, freedom of speech violated. This affected thousands. Well, my father was one of them. All his life, he hated fascism and communism equally and spoke openly and publicly against them. He was a liberal, but he loathed communism. And he was refused in 1953, when McCarthy still had this tyrannical grip on the government. My father was refused by the State Department to renew his passport. And the lie, it seems incredible. They said, because of your constant adherence to the Communist Party line, he who had spoken publicly against communism. And he sometimes quoted, he had quite a sense of humor, a joke going around at that time. A man being arrested by the police because they claimed he was a communist. And as he was dragged off, handcuffed, he shouted, "But I'm an anti-communist." And the policeman said, "I don't care what kind of communist you are, tell that to the judge." And insanity swept the nation. I remember it very well. It affected thousands and thousands. And now, of course, what is happening in our own streets, yet another reign of terror. Teams of terror being sent into our cities. I don't need to describe to you what is happening in the streets of our great cities. You know it well. You know it well. It is the worst of the three that I've seen in my lifetime. Detention, deporting, violence, outrage in the streets. Trump said the other day, we arrested thousands of dangerous criminals there in Minnesota. I would like to know who these dangerous criminals are. The 5-year-old boy still in detention. The young mother dragged out of her car, crying, holding her baby daughter. The young spouse on her way to the court, a spouse of an American citizen on her way to the court to finalize the last steps of her becoming a legal citizen, arrested on the steps of the courthouse, kept in detention for days, denied medication, denied legal counsel, denied contact with her family. We're told lies in every single one of these historical clean sweeps, purges that I've mentioned. Lies were told by the governments. The Emperor Decius said of the Christians, they burned down cities. In the Jewish pogroms, the governments were saying they killed Christian children and they poison wells and they bring the great plagues. In the French and Russian revolutions, everyone connected in any way with aristocrats was a persecutor of the poor. And so on. The lies now, dangerous criminals. They are saying now, Trump and company, They're trying, now that the polls are turned violently against them, and Republicans are actually questioning his tactics. They're talking about de-escalation, escalation. I am very, very skeptical of this de-escalation. It's interesting that the very day that his popularity in the polls is tanking, and Republican senators and legislators are asking pointed questions, that all of a sudden the Department of Justice is releasing thousands of pages of Epstein investigation that people have been pleading for many, many months. On this day, let's distract those citizens out there so they can talk about something else. Distractions is the first step. I've never known a despotic head of state to change his intention at all, unless forced to, either by war or by the revolt of his own people, or the stand of his own party members against him. Otherwise, they do not change, either in their intentions, much less their motivations. What is evil? That which destroys, denies, constricts the personhood, the humanness in another person. That which says the individual does not matter. Only our policies matter. The individual doesn't matter. Quotas matter. Numbers matter. Voting blocks matter, but not the individual. But 250 years ago, actually 251 years ago, a group of citizens of the colonies of America got together, and they came out with a statement. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's fascinating to read the whole declaration from beginning to end. A vision was taking form. The individual matters. Each human being matters. I'm always fascinated by that inclusion of pursuit of happiness, not just life and liberty, but also quality of life. And the ending statement in that Declaration of Independence, we support this and we pledge together our life, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The vision. Yes, there were blind spots. They were curiously unaware of the rights of women, the legal rights of women, or the rights of slaves, black slaves, not to speak of American-born American natives. But through the slow decades that have gone by, more and more of these rights have been spelled out, and the vision deepens and widens. You know what's going on in Minneapolis right now? It's a crucible. Just the way the city of Boston was a crucible 250 years ago, the anniversary of our independence. The uproar beginning Immigrants matter. Each individual among them matter. They have the right to due process, to medicine, to respect for their humanness. Each one deserves it. A young man, Alexander Pretty, a few days ago saw a woman he didn't know thrown violently down in the snow there in Minneapolis by a masked gang of federal agents. He didn't know her, but she mattered. And he gave up his life being shot in the back at least 7 times, going to her help. His last words were to her, a woman he didn't know but who mattered. Are you okay? I think you and I can take heart. There's an uproar going on. There's a demand now for a nationwide strike. People are filling the streets, roaring. This has to stop. We can take heart, this vision. And once a vision is envisioned, you can't unvision it. It is there. And we are rising up on this 250th anniversary, saying each one of us matters. Let's take heart into this. You and I pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Thank you for being with me. I'll see you again next week.